Hello my friends! Today we will take a look at Panasonic GH5S. The GH5S is definitely a very interesting camera that is aiming at professional videographers and offering some very advanced video features that cannot be found in any other mirrorless or DSLR camera. In this video we will take a look at how it performs, how is the handling, and how it generally meets the requirements of advanced videographers. Starting with the handling and the build quality, the GH5S uses the same body style as the regular GH5. The only differences are the red accents on the video recording button, dry mode dial, and the red leather on the front of the camera. The build quality is excellent as expected from Panasonic high-end camera. It uses magnesium frame, the coating is very high quality, so is the material on the grip, and all of the buttons have very good feel as well. GH5S is fully weather sealed, so it can handle tough conditions. GH5 and GH5S are currently the biggest Micro Four Thirds cameras, which is a good thing in my opinion, because the handling on both GH5 and GH5S is really great. The grip is very well shaped. In terms of the controls, there is a ton of custom buttons on the GH5S, and you can basically set anything on any of those buttons, including the 4 buttons on the thumb dial. There are also dedicated buttons for the white balance, ISO and exposure compensation, and one extra button on the top of the camera. There is also one more function button on the front, so you have basically endless options for customization. The joystick is also well placed in my opinion, and you can use it to move focus point around or to control anything in the menu, and you can click it down to reset the focus point to the center of the frame. The only minor imperfection is the placement of the display button, which is easy to press accidentally, but overall the handling on the GH5S is great, and it is the second best handling camera that I've tested after the Panasonic G9. Regarding the ports, there is everything that you would expect, including the full-size HDMI port, USB-C port, which I really like to see, the microphone jack and the headphone jack as well. GH5S also has 2 SD card slots, both are UHS 2 compatible, and you can set both to record simultaneously, switch from the first SD card to the second when the first one is full, or shoot stills and video to different cards. The display on GH5S is 3.2-inch touchscreen with very high resolution of 1.62 million dots and refresh rate up to 120 Hz, which means that it is very sharp, and thanks to that refresh rate, basically without lag. It is fully rotatable, so shooting at low angles is not a problem, and it is also very useful if you need to film yourself in front of the camera. The viewfinder also has very high 3.68 million dot resolution and 120 Hz refresh rate. The magnification is 0.72 times, so it is not as impressive as massive 0.83 times magnification viewfinder in the G9, but it is definitely fine to use and also bright enough. The battery life is generally good. It uses new BLF19E batteries. It is rated for 440 shots, and you should be able to get more than 2 hours of 4K video on single charge, depending on the settings, which is a very good result. And now let's move on to the most interesting part of this camera, which is the sensor. GH5S is still considered to be a Micro Four Thirds camera, but the sensor in the GH5 is very different than usual Micro Four Thirds sensor because it is so-called multi-aspect ratio sensor. That means that the sensor is actually bigger than light circle covering it, so the very corners of the sensor are actually never used. The sensor uses different pixels to shoot video depending on the aspect ratio that you choose. This means that the diagonal field of view is the same regardless whether you shoot 4K DCI video, 16:9 video or 4:3 video, because while shooting 4K DCI, the sensor uses full width, whereas while shooting 4:3 it uses the full height. This actually changes the crop factor. When shooting 4096 by 2160 DCI 4K, the crop factor is just 1.86 times. The effective resolution of the sensor is 10.3 megapixels, which is what is needed for 1:1 pixel readout for 4K DCI and Ultra HD video. The low resolution also means that the individual pixels are larger, which means that the pixels can gather more light and information, which results in less noise at high ISO, better dynamic range, lower requirements for the sensor readout and processing power, and not having problems with rolling shutter or overheating. One thing that I was really curious about is the sharpness of the video in comparison with downsampled video from high-resolution sensor. Here we have the samples from the GH5S and the G9, which has 20 megapixel sensor. It shoots 5.2K video and it downsamples that to Ultra HD 4K video, which gives you more detail in comparison with cropped 4K video like from G85 or 1DX Mark II for example. But the sharpness of the footage from the GH5S is surprisingly good. It is actually not worse than the GH5S, which means that the Panasonic got the processing really right, so there is absolutely no reason to be concerned with the sharpness of the video. Regarding the ISO performance, the GH5S uses dual native ISO, which means that there are two circuits for amplifying the signal. The lower native ISO is at 400 and the higher native ISO is at 2500. Here we have my ISO torture test with harsh highlights and unforgiving shadows, so keep in mind that this scene is basically the worst case scenario. Thanks to the dual native ISO, the GH5S holds up very well up to ISO 6400. There is actually pretty little difference between ISO 1600 and 6400. Again, thanks to the dual native ISO, which is really great. The footage is perfectly usable up to ISO 6400. When you go to ISO 12800, the noise is clearly visible in this scene. We can also see some minor shift in the colors, but it is still usable after color grading, and in less demanding scenes it would be definitely usable. I personally wouldn't go above ISO 12800 unless necessary. Generally, I would try to stay below ISO 6400, which is very good result, and I am generally very happy with the ISO performance. The dynamic range is the best at native ISO values, so at 400 and 2500. Again, up to ISO 6400 the dynamic range is really good, and ISO 12800 is in case of emergency option. That brings us to my maybe most favorite thing about the GH5S, which are the codecs and picture profiles. The big thing with the GH5S is 10-bit 422 video that you can shoot up to 4096 by 2160 DCI 4K in 24, 25 or 30 frames per second. This combined with a vlog provides outstanding flat footage with loads of dynamic range, which is just pure joy to color grade. It is very easy to color grade, you can push it very far, the color science is excellent, so I didn't have to shift individual colors. The lowest available ISO while shooting vlog is 320, which is very low for a log profile, so we won't have to use very dense filters. As you can see in this sample, the dynamic range is high enough to capture both color in the sky and details in the shadows in this very difficult scene, and overall this is now my most favorite codec and picture style combination for color grading from any camera. I also really like that you can use LUT loaded into GH5S to be able to see on the display how the flat footage will look after applying lookup table in post, which will also help you a lot with setting the right exposure. Hybrid log gamma is also available on the GH5S. It is a delivery standard unlike the vlog, and it is also supported by YouTube. It is not meant for color grading, although it is quite flat. It is a fairly new standard, and how good will the picture be also depends on the viewing device and its HDR capabilities. It captures a lot of dynamic range as well, and it actually looks really good with this hybrid log gamma to 709 LUT, but it is not that great for color grading. You can also choose between 150 megabits per second long GOP and 400 megabits per second all intra recording in 4K in 24 or 25 frames per second while shooting Ultra HD 4K, but only at 24 frames per second in DCI 4K, which is a bit odd. To be honest, in the real world use, there is very little difference between the 150 and 400 megabits per second codec. You would need to zoom in quite a bit to see the difference. So personally, I would only use that for very serious work. The all-intra codec is easier to work with in editing software, so the playback will be smoother and the exporting time will be about 33% shorter. For usual work, the 150 megabits per second long GOP is completely fine. Also keep in mind that if you want to shoot in 400 megabits per second, you will have to use expensive UHS-2 cards with V60 or higher certification. I use SanDisk Extreme Pro UHS-2 and these work very well. Regarding the slow motion, you can shoot 50 or 60 frames per second 4K video, which is great of course, but only at 10 bit, which is fine by me. I'm always glad to have 4K 60p at all. In 1080p, you can go as high as 240 frames per second, but that is through the variable frame rate, so it means that you will get footage that is already slowed down to 24, 25 or 30 frames per second. Up to 200 frames per second it is without cropping the picture. 225 and 240 frames per second are done with the crop. 1080p shot in VFR up to 100 frames per second looks pretty good. Above 100 frames per second it is a bit too soft for my taste. It is also not possible to use autofocus or record audio in VFR mode, but still it is 240 frames per second, which is always cool to have. Regarding the autofocus, since the introduction of the G9, Panasonic has made a huge improvements in their autofocus system. This GH5S is also updated to version 1.1, where the autofocus was improved, and I have to say that it is generally good. You can also choose the speed and sensitivity of the autofocus in video on the GH5S. These settings have quite a big impact, so you can play around with these, but even more important is which focus area mode you choose. The single point works great, the face tracking also works very well. In my experience, it doesn't drift off the face. The regular tracking is probably the most impressive. This works great in the G9 as well. 2 years ago, I honestly wouldn't believe that contrast autofocus will be capable of doing this, so it seems that Panasonic's DFD technology works really well, and the autofocus is definitely usable. You just need to try different modes to find out what works best in a specific situation. You can also use focus transition feature, where the camera will make a smooth focus pull instead of you. The lack of in-body image stabilization in the GH5S has caused a lot of controversy. The reason is probably the combination of multi-aspect ratio sensor and problems with the jitter of in-body image stabilization whilst it is turned off in situations like when the camera is mounted in the car driving on the rough road. For advanced video production, this camera will probably be stabilized by gimbal or glide cam. For handheld shooting, the footage of course won't be as smooth as with the GH5 or G9, but Panasonic has a wide variety of stabilized lenses, like my favorite Leica 12-60mm f2.8-4 or 50-200mm f2.8-4 telephoto lens, and those have great optical stabilization that will reduce the shake a lot. For me, the lack of in-body image stabilization is not a deal breaker, because that multi-aspect ratio sensor is in my opinion worth the sacrifice. If you rely on the in-body image stabilization a lot, the regular GH5 will be a better choice if you don't want to use a gimbal. For advanced filmmaking, you can also use some very advanced features like the vectorscope, anamorphic 4x3 mode, option to set shutter angle and gain instead of shutter speed and ISO, synchro scan for adjusting the shutter speed, timecode in and out, and so on. And it goes without saying that things like histogram, focus peaking, focus magnification, zebra stripes, and so on are here as well. So the GH5S is definitely a complete package for advanced filmmaking. I don't think that anybody will buy the GH5S for stills, because 10.28 megapixels is a bit too low resolution for stills, but the GH5S is actually the first Panasonic to offer 14-bit RAW. It can go quite high with the ISO thanks to those larger pixels. The JPEG colors from the GH5S are actually some of the best that I've ever seen, so there is actually no reason not to shoot stills for social media or other low resolution platforms with the GH5S if you already have one. So to sum up this review, I have to say that I like the GH5S a lot. For me, the biggest highlight of the GH5S is that DCI 4K 10-bit 422 output with V-Lock. That is just incredible footage out of that great sensor. The color science is very good, so is the handling and the feature set. It performs very well in low light, and the autofocus is more than usable as well. I understand the reasons for the lack of in-body image stabilization, so overall I think that the GH5S is a great choice for advanced filmmaking, documentaries, TV productions. It would be an excellent B camera for large cine cameras like Red, ARRI or Panasonic VariCam, but also for advanced YouTubers. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.